And so the French build Fort Duquesne on the point. And George Washington was sent to take it back, and he actually got beat up pretty good, but we'll talk about that later. What's important is that the British retake Fort Duquesne at a later time and name it Fort Pitt, after William Pitt, the Prime Minister of England, and that's what turns out to be the city of Pittsburgh. So we are essentially named after a Prime Minister of Britain. Oh, hey students, I'm just talking with my friends about how Pittsburgh got its name, and it happened to be during the French and Indian War. That's how it all went down. So this is a very relevant topic to the lesson for today, because our lesson today is essentially the French and Indian War, shoved into a single lesson. So we have a lot to cover, so I'll be quick and brief. I'll try to be. There's so much good history to talk about that we just don't have time for. So, there's no love between Britain and France. They were both making money in the colonies, but in different ways. We shoot down to the map here. You can see this is the French part of North America and the British part. And this is the zone we're fighting over. The Ohio River Valley, Pittsburgh, what one might call the heart of the Ohio River Valley, is floating around here somewhere. It's not Pittsburgh yet. It's just a lot of people call it the Forks, because it's where the rivers meet into a point. And both Britain and France want this territory. Now, France, they make their money mostly in fur trapping. They don't build a lot of large settlements. They treat the natives pretty well. A lot of French fur trappers, in fact, marry Indian women. But Britain, the British colonies, they settle permanently. They clear lots of land for farming, and they're pretty mean to the native population. So both sides want this territory. They're both world superpowers that already fight each other all the time, and now that fighting is going to spread to the colonies. Now, a good starting point to learn about for French and Indian War is when the governor of Virginia sends Colonel George Washington, quite a young man, I believe he was 22 at the time, to go basically take control of the Forks, the point where downtown Pittsburgh is today. And he's on his way there, and he finds out the French have beat him to it. They already are building a fort there. Washington gets in a scuffle with some French people, some French folk, who it is alleged were actually sent to find Washington and offer terms before any battle took place. But he goes ahead and attacks them and has a small victory. There's a lot more story to this, involving one of Washington's Indian guides killing the commander of the French there, and then that's bad because his relative is over at Fort Duquesne and he wants revenge, but that's for you to find out. We don't want to go into that much detail. I want to, but I can't. The big thing is the French get away and they go back to Fort Duquesne and say, hey, there's this force of Virginians coming to take the fort, coming here to take this land. So they send out a counterattack. And Washington knows a counterattack is coming, so they throw up Fort Necessity right here. It's not much more than a stockade of wood, and they're badly outnumbered, and Washington loses. And in some shaky terms that Washington didn't fully understand because he didn't speak French, he basically surrendered the fort and really the Ohio River Valley for quite a while. And he is sent with most of his men that lived back to Virginia. This is kind of thought of as the first battle of the French and Indian War in the colonies. You see, to defend their territory, they knew that the British were going to be encroaching. They built a chain of forts, and these are the locations of a lot of battles of the French and Indian War. Basically, both sides trying to take more territory. In terms of Indian allies, the French had more because, well, like we had mentioned, they were nicer to the Indians. They married the women and traded with them, and for the most part didn't steal their land. And as a result, they had a lot more Indian allies than the British and their colonists. The British and their colonists did try to make Indian allies with the Iroquois Confederacy, which was sort of like a loose government / alliance of 6 Native American tribes. But it came to nothing. The Iroquois Confederacy simply agreed to be neutral, or just not take sides. These negotiations happened in Albany, New York, also in Albany, New York at the same time. They were trying to hash out some kind of loose government for the colonies themselves so that they could respond to the French threat in whole. And the delegates sent agreed on a plan by Benjamin Franklin called the Albany Plan of the Union. But when it was sent back to the states for approval, none of them basically agreed, because none of them wanted to cede any of their power to some kind of larger colonial government. So really, the whole Albany meetings were just a big failure. But I guess at the least, they got the Iroquois Confederacy to agree to be neutral. I guess that's a small victory. So the war grinds on. The French had the momentum at first with a string of early successes, and their native allies would attack settlements on the colonial frontier. And then there was a big shift. It's generally agreed upon by historians that the tide changed when William Pitt became the Prime Minister of England. It's sort of comparable to a president. They're in charge of the executive branch, so they still have a royalty, but they have a prime minister as well. So William Pitt becomes the prime minister, and he basically decides to take the whole conflict in the colonies a lot more seriously. He puts more resources into the war in the colonies, sends some good generals and more troops, and that's when the British start having victories. And William Pitt's goal was not just to take the Ohio River Valley, but Canada as well. And there's a whole lot of history there that we can't get into. And his plan was also, hey, colonial support for the war will increase if we don't tax them for it. We'll get them later after the war. We'll tax them later. Big mistake? Possibly. But the British take Fort Duquesne. Washington failed to. Another victory would be Louisbourg, Fort Frontenac, and the French capital of Quebec. The attack on Quebec is a pretty significant historical event. For the genius of it, see, Quebec was on one side of it was on a sheer cliff face, and the French never thought they would get attacked from that side. There's a big field over there, but then it was just cliff. So it was very lightly defended, and the British sort of snuck across. There was a river down at the bottom. You can see in this picture. There's the city, and then there's a field, and there's this cliff, and the British climbed the cliff in the night, and were assembled for battle on the Plains of Abraham the next day, and the French weren't ready for it, and they lost. When Britain took Montreal the next year, the war was pretty much over for France. They have a Treaty of Paris. Now, it's important to understand, but they actually don't go into it almost at all in your book, about the French and Indian War was really a sub-war of a larger war called the 7 Years' War between Britain and France. And so they Britain and France meet in Paris to hash out a treaty for the whole 7 Years' War, which includes the French and Indian War. And as a result, some territory changes because France basically lost. This was before the war. So France had all this up into Canada. They claimed they had this contested area. Now Britain had this area and claimed they had this area. And that's really what the whole war was about, was land in North America. And then afterwards, you can see purple. Britain has a whole lot of Canada. France is left with all this over here. And somehow Britain picks up Florida, which belonged to Spain, but Spain was allied in that whole 7 Years' War with France, so they had to give up land, and then in return, France gave them Louisiana. It was very strange. But that's how it went down. There's a lot more studying we could do that I wish we could. we don't. Now the important thing is, because we're in 8th grade, some new policies came out from Britain after the French and Indian War, and this has negative impacts with the Native Americans. So let's talk about that real quick. Since the natives mostly sided with France, and France lost, they are basically now, all the natives that were living in what was French territory that fought with the French are now living in British territory, and that's very bad for them. The British aren't going to be very nice to them. They just basically take their land. They don't pay them for it. When they do business with them, they overcharge them, and they didn't like this very much. One man in particular didn't like it at all. He fought fiercely against the British and the colonists in the French and Indian War. His name was Pontiac. His actions were called Pontiac's War. Basically, after the French and Indian War ended, and the French were like, hey, Chief Pontiac, we kind of lost, and we signed the Treaty of Paris. Pontiac wanted to keep fighting, but without the support of the French, a lot of his allied tribes that were fighting with him sort of were like, yep, we're done, I'm taking my ball and going home. To prevent more problems with the natives, after the conclusion of the French-Indian War, we have the Proclamation of 1763, which we talked about before, which prevented colonists from sailing too far west. Not only was this a measure, however, to prevent conflicts between settlers and natives, but an attempt by the British Empire to keep colonists close to the coast where Britain enacted more control. So they didn't want them getting uppity out there in the wilderness and doing what they want to do. So you have this. As a result of the war, you have an increased presence of troops in the colonies, and the colonists didn't really like that either. And then we're going to have these plans of Britain to tax the colonists after the French and Indian War to pay for the French and Indian War. Remember, Pitt decided to stop that, likely to increase approval for the war. It's hard to fight a war when people don't approve. And that's going to come. So you can see all these agitating factors that will lead us into our next chapter, which is really our This is How the Revolution Starts chapter, followed by a chapter that is the Revolution. So that's where we're going. That's where we're headed. Now, like I said, this is an unfortunate, extreme, brief breakdown of the French and Indian War, but there's tons of information out there. So there's a really good video here by Crash Course in History on YouTube on the 7 Years' War, so you can get the big picture of what was going on. There's an ad there, but lame sauce. There's a nice page here on the Battle of Fort Necessity. It goes into a lot of nitty-gritty details on Washington and the weapons they had at Fort Necessity. They had some swivel guns. What happened? They dug some trenches. Guys were trying to fight in the trenches. They were waist deep in water. It was not a good situation for Washington. There's a little bit here on Pontiac's War and the Battle for Quebec, which is oftentimes called the Plains of Abraham. I'm going to fix that link. So that's what we have, and then you have a quiz on the next page. And last question. Some of the questions are a little tough, but I think you'll be fine if you read the chapter and read the lesson. You'll be good to go. So all these links are supplemental. They're not required for the quiz, but it's more information there for you history buffs. I would almost suggest doing the quiz and then coming back to look at these so there's no confusion. This video here is really good. It's really good big picture stuff. But like I said, it's supplemental. It's not on the quiz. So that's what we have for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.